A key diplomatic event is slowly drawing to a close in New York as world leaders head home after the high-level UN General Assembly, a key gathering that sought to place development at the center of an increasingly fractured world. From the general debate to summits on the Sustainable Development Goals and climate ambition, key meetings on financing for development and pandemic preparedness, the means of implementation remains a key area of friction between the developing South and the developed North. For more, we speak to our correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who's been monitoring events for us all week at the UN. Great to have you with us as always, Sherwin. There is a real sense that developing nations, I heard our own president, are becoming more and more impatient, particularly around financing and these big global finance organizations. Give us some of the key takeaways.
One key takeaway, Francis, is that the developing world, has really been able to set the agenda at this high-level week of the UN General Assembly, from financing for development, talking about the means of implementation, the need for reforming the international financial architecture, including issues around debt repayments. You know, there's a statistic that has been flying around the United Nations this year that almost half of the planet, some 3.3 billion people, live in countries where they pay more on their debt repayments than on quality health and quality education. So, and there was a real sense that perhaps even the appearance here for the first time of Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, might suck the energy out of the room and, focus more on geopolitical tensions rather than on this pressing development agenda in terms of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals that are lagging. Only 15% of the targets are being implemented, and at the core of that is the lack of means to implement this agenda, and by that I mean money. So, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We must focus on financing this development agenda. The implementation has been lagging, but you also then need to resolve issues like Ukraine. You also need to resolve issues like the instability we are seeing in West Africa. There was a key meeting on the humanitarian needs in Sudan and how this 5-month conflict is ripping that country apart. And one cannot focus on development. One cannot focus on eradicating poverty, on food security, on quality health, on clean water and sanitation, and on strong governance and justice and peace and institutions if you are focused on funneling weapons into war zones, instability in terms of coups in West Africa. So we need to resolve these issues so that we can have an all-hands-on-deck approach in terms of implementing the SDGs, which are lagging some halfway towards that 2030 deadline.
And many would welcome a renewed impetus towards the Sustainable Development Goals. We did see some consensus around two areas. The political declaration, Sherwin, adopted by the General Assembly, the declarations on health coverage and pandemic preparedness. Tell us more.
Yeah, so two matters that speak to how consensus can work in this dysfunctional United Nations. I mean, the Secretary General also, just to touch on what he said earlier this week, Francis, he talked about a world becoming unhinged, geopolitical tensions rising, global challenges mounting, and we seem incapable of coming together to respond. Well, they have managed to come together and respond in terms of a political declaration adopted earlier this week in the General Assembly as it relates to universal health coverage. Of course, one of the Sustainable Development Goals deals with health and well-being, and this was heads of state and government reaffirming that health is a precondition for the implementation of the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, and strongly recommits member states to achieve universal health coverage by 2030. There was also a political declaration adopted by the General Assembly dealing with pandemic preparedness. It's a document that works to make access to pandemic-related products such as vaccines, diagnostics and therapeutics timely, sustainable and equitable in the context that the next pandemic is going to come, right? We're sort of emerging from COVID-19. COVID-19 isn't going away, and this is what Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus of the World Health Organization had to say in the aftermath of that adoption. Watch.
First, I would like to start by thanking the President and all member states for endorsing the political declaration. This is a very historic day, and thank you so much indeed. We may be tempted to think that the COVID-19 pandemic is history. But history teaches us that COVID-19 will not be the last pandemic. The question we all face is whether we will be ready when the next one arrives. As leaders, we have a collective responsibility to make sure we are ready. We have a collective responsibility to protect our societies and economies. The political declaration you just have agreed today is a commitment that together we will live up to our responsibility.
And so, Francis, very much speaking to what the world needs to do, creating a framework for member states to go home and implement in their national jurisdictions, because we do know that while we are struggling to emerge from this pandemic, there are more on the horizon and the world needs to be better fortified and prepared for that.
So, Sherwin, earlier you said you can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can focus on development, but of course those wars and conflicts are still there, namely Ukraine and Sudan, the stalemates that we're seeing. Any significant movements on those?
Well, difficult to move in a Security Council that remains so divided and unreformed given the vetoes that certain members of this council wield. I'll tell you what the SG said earlier this week. He said, while we welcome the move to a multipolar world, right? Multipolarity is a big word, certainly emerging out of the BRICS summit earlier this year. And he warned that it did not guarantee peace, making the case for a strong multilateral system that can better balance these forces. So reform is very much part of the conversation when you talk about dealing with intractable conflicts, even new conflicts like the one in Ukraine, like the civil war we are seeing in Sudan. There was a big meeting, a ministerial meeting on the humanitarian needs in Sudan. But of course, even the muscular diplomacy we have seen from the African Union and various regional blocs, IGAD, for example, we are not seeing the requisite political movement towards direct negotiations between the parties that are actually going to offer a sustainable ceasefire in terms of Sudan, while the conflict is exacerbating a country that faces precarious development conditions in a region that is very, very fragile, right? You're surrounded by countries like the Central African Republic, South Sudan, Ethiopia, countries themselves that are emerging from conflict. So the Secretary General making the point that we need to reform these institutions in the multilateral sphere so that you can deal better with situations like the one in Sudan. And of course, the conflict in Ukraine. We heard some positive news from President Ramaphosa earlier this week in terms of the African Peace Initiative, talking about the need for confidence-building measures. He referenced the return of some of the children abducted from Ukraine. That's beginning. Some of these kids are being repatriated to Ukraine. He also talked about prisoner swaps between the two countries as conditions for building blocks towards peace negotiations. But unfortunately, the Secretary General has been very, very clear, Francis, that the conditions are not ripe yet for direct negotiations as weapons, of course, continue to flow into either side of that conflict.